Good afternoon, everyone. This is Puleng and Jed from UNEP. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. You should be able to see the slides. Come, Jed, I'm getting to the frame here. You should be able to see the slides, and I will move over to the next slide so you can see our agenda. So Demetrius from Piraeus Bank will run us through the introductory slides. We'll then hand over to Neru from Land Bank, who will go through the principles. Emily Fry from Barclays will do target setting and accountability. Then we'll hand back to Neru to talk through implementation of the principles. And going forward, I'll actually be presented by my colleague Simone, who will join us shortly. So thank you once again for joining. And Demetrius, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Puleng. Good afternoon from Athens. I would I'd like to run you through the the principles in terms of what led UNEP to this decision, to come up with principles for responsible banking. The economic crisis in 2008 delivered a very strong blow to the trust in banks. Customers and clients since then are still struggling, still show their distrust in the banks, and the banks are trying very hard to regain what they lost in the last decade. In response to this issue, banks members of UNEP in the early 2018 got together, and a group of about 28 banks started working on formulating principles for responsible and sustainable banking that will help the banks get on the right track again, follow a path for sustainability, and try to avoid the mistakes that they did in the past. The principles were presented in their first consultation version in Paris in November last year, and since then and until the end of May, they are up for public consultation. Now, what are the objectives of the principles? Well, basically, these principles, there are 6, aim at defining and shaping and ultimately securing the bank's industry's role in the society and the economy for the 21st century. They basically want to show the way, the path, and to guide the banks in becoming more responsible and more sustainable and responding to the needs of society as these needs are described in the SDGs and in the Paris Climate Agreement. The second objective is to actually strengthen the trust and to get the customers more engaged. The third objective is to enable banks to demonstrate and communicate their purpose and contribution to society. And the fourth objective is to set the global benchmark for responsible banking and provide guidance which is practical, which banks can follow, which banks can implement to achieve the needs of society. Next slide, please. So what are the key features of these principles? Well, these principles target 3 levels: the transactional level, the portfolio level, and the strategic level of a bank. So if a bank wants to implement these principles, they will have to make strategic decisions. They have to incorporate it in their strategies and policies. They have to see how they can implement or how they can apply the principles in managing their portfolio and managing transactional level as well. So the principles aim at aligning the goals of society as they expressed in the Paris and Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, and to relevant national and regional frameworks. The second key feature of the principles is target setting. It's very important that banks realize, map where they have their impacts, where they have the most positive impacts, and try to invest in those areas, increasing the positive impacts, and at the same time reducing the negative impacts. The third key feature of the principles is transparency and accountability. Setting targets and trying to address society's goals is something that has to be done in a very transparent way. Banks that will endorse these principles will set targets, they will be accountable for these targets, and they will report them publicly. This also involves a review process which will ensure that the banks do what they actually say they are doing. And the last key feature, which is very important, is that the principles include an implementation guidance. This can be seen in the sector of the version which is on the internet, on the website, where every principle is explained in detail how banks, regardless of where they are, where they stand in terms of maturity and sustainability, whether they're beginners or whether they're intermediate or whether they are advanced, how they can actually implement each and one of those principles. The target is, and the objective is to address all principles, all 6 principles in a holistic manner. It's not a question of cherry picking principles. It's a question of dealing with all the principles in a holistic manner. So the guidance provides the tools and methodologies. It provides good examples. It provides case studies, which will help the banks to implement in the best manner the principles that they will endorse. It is also very important to stress here that this part, the implementation guidance, is a dynamic part. It will be updated with new examples and new case studies, and there will be exchange of experience between all those banks that will be implementing the principles, which will be officially presented in September in New York, and that's when the official, let's say, signing ceremony will take place. Let's move on to the last slide of this introduction, and the question is, who can sign the principles? Who are the principles for? Well, these principles have been made by banks, and they address banks. Any bank, no matter where it stands in any part of the world, can sign up to these principles upon their release officially, which will be in September 2019, as I mentioned before. So any bank that generally is committed to follow a sustainability path and to act in a responsible way towards its stakeholders, its employees, its shareholders, and wants to set targets, ambitious targets, in order to address the challenges that our planet faces and to address the needs of society as these are expressed through the SDGs and the climate and the Paris Climate Agreement, can sign up to these principles. Thank you. Oh, and the last slide. These are the 28 banks. Literally, you can see that they're from all over the world, from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from Australia. Small banks, big banks, and banks that are all contributing to formulating the principles, which hopefully will be signed by as many banks as possible in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Demetrius. I will now hand over to Neru Pillay from Land Bank to discuss the principles with us. Neru, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Puleng, and good morning or good afternoon to everybody who is participating in this webinar. Just building on what Demetrios said, the core group of banks have developed 6 principles to shape our future. So we'll go through each principle in terms of defining the principle, and then 1 or 2 points just to add on in terms of how one understands the expectation of the principle. So principle 1 is alignment. The first principle then says we will align our business strategy to be consistent with and contribute to individuals' needs and society's goals as expressed in the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement and relevant national and regional frameworks, We will focus our efforts where we have the most significant impact. So part of what we understand by this is that banks will integrate society's goals into your business strategy and key business decisions, including your capital allocation decisions. You'll identify areas of most significant positive and negative environmental, social, and economic impacts. Set and publish targets that align your business with and ensure your bank's significant contribution to SDGs and Paris Climate Agreement. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay. Principle number 2 focuses on impact. The principle says we will continuously increase our positive impacts while reducing the negative impacts on and managing the risks to people and environment resulting from our activities, products, and services. Banks will identify, assess, and be transparent on significant potential positive and negative impacts, define KPIs to address, reduce, and mitigate significant negative impacts, and to scale up positive impacts, and undertake forward-looking assessments of sustainability-related risks and opportunities at transaction, portfolio, and strategic level. Thank you. Next slide, please. Principle number 3 focuses on clients and customers, and it says we will work responsibly with our clients and our customers to encourage sustainable practices and enable economic activities that create shared prosperity for current and future generations. Again, banks will systematically support clients in adopting new technologies, business models, and practices, and encourage and support sustainable behavior and consumption choices among retail customers. We'll take actions such as development of new products and services or sustainability-related incentives and contract conditions, and help ensure that your retail customers have the knowledge and skills to effectively manage their finances. Next slide, please. Principle number 4 focuses on stakeholders, and it says we will proactively and responsibly consult, engage, and partner with relevant stakeholders to achieve society's goals. This would involve identifying key external stakeholders, paying special attention to stakeholders directly or indirectly affected by the bank's business practices and decisions, engage, listen to, and consult regarding the material issues in your strategy and business practices, create partnerships that enable your bank to achieve more. Engagement with regulators and policymakers is aligned with the goals and objectives of these principles and advocate for sustainable policies. Next slide, please. Principle number 5 focuses on governance and target setting. It says we will implement our commitment to these principles through effective governance and a culture of responsible banking, demonstrating ambition and accountability by setting public targets relating to our most significant impacts. This would involve assigning roles and responsibilities with sufficient status, influence, and resources across all functional areas of the bank. Establish effective policies and management systems to integrate sustainability objectives into decision-making processes across the bank, and actively communicate top-level buy-in and integrate sustainability targets into performance assessments, remuneration schemes, and promotion decisions. And the final 6th principle focuses on transparency and accountability, and it says that we will periodically review our individual and collective implementation of these principles and be transparent about and accountable for our positive and negative impacts and our contribution to society's goals. What this means is that within the first 14 months of becoming a signatory, public report on positive and negative impact and implementation of the principles. Banks will undergo an annual individual review process whose requirements differ depending on the self-declared level of the bank. Thank you, Puleng.
Thank you very much, Niru. I will now hand over to Emily Fry from Barclays, who will run through the target setting and accountability mechanism. Emily, over to you.
Thanks so much, Puleng, and thanks everyone for joining today. In terms of the target setting and accountability piece, it's obviously kind of embedded throughout the principles themselves and explicitly part of one of the principles, but is a thread throughout that really helps tie the principles together. So we'll go into some more detail around the target setting requirements for banks as part of the PRB process. So in terms of thinking through, I guess, once you've digested the detail of the different principles, thinking through what it means in terms of actually delivering on the targets for each bank, we suggest that this includes delivering a materiality assessment. So really thinking through where are the priority areas for each bank and which actually has the most significant positive and negative social, environmental, and economic impacts on and risks to society as well. So really thinking through what that means for a financing institution and where that makes sense for each entity. And then in terms of what the requirement is for a bank is within 12 months of becoming a signatory. So beginning in September this year, you can set objectives and targets that really reflect the scale that of the bank's impacts within those material areas. And the goals really should be aiming to meet or exceed the ambitions set out in some of the frameworks that we've mentioned again throughout the principles and also throughout the guidance document, which we obviously encourage everyone to read. And then in terms of the third section, implementation, in order to implement the targets, we obviously need to set kind of KPIs, key performance indicators within that, allocate the respective resources, and establish that monitoring approach so that each year or each 6 months, whatever, for each bank, you're able to see the progress towards those goals. We expect goals to not be kind of single year, but probably multi-year, and therefore we expect to have several kind of steps towards that to be a journey and for each target to take time. I'd love to turn to the next slide if possible. In terms of accountability, this is obviously, again, a really huge thread of the principles. We need to be accountable to stakeholders, to the UNEP itself, and to ourselves. And so in terms of how that's approached, we're looking for a simple high-level report to be done on an annual basis. It's a very light touch kind of template where you can link to existing reporting and address how you're implementing the principles for responsible banking. So we would each be required to submit a completed template to UNEP FI on an annual basis, which references that information. On to the next slide. Thank you. At the same time, we recognize that there's many different banks approaching the banking principles from many different stages of the journey, of the sustainability journey. And so there are various stages that you can nominate yourself to when you are looking to sign up to the principles or endorse the principles at this stage. So there's the starter bank, the intermediate bank, and the advanced bank. This is a self-determined allocation. It's not something that UNEP or anyone else would kind of assign to you. But in terms of the different requirements within those, it has slightly different requirements. So if you're a starter bank, kind of you need to be transparent and you need to provide that reporting template, and UNEP FI will be able to provide that recommendations for feedback and for improvement. You're able to be a starter bank for 24 months, before which you would transition to an intermediate bank, which again requires the transparent piece, but also you're required to go through the target setting process. And again, UNEP FI will be able to provide feedback on that. If you're an advanced bank, again, we have the transparency, target setting requirements and progress as well to really show your requirements. But instead of UNEP FI providing that feedback, there would be a formal ask to an independent reviewer to assess the or an assurer to assess whether the requirements are fulfilled based on the reporting template. So that would be an additional step, and you'd also be expected to look to the progress throughout the years that you are part of this process. You don't have to sign up as a starter bank. You can also sign up as an advanced bank if you're already there. So again, this is something that is very self-nominated. But and there's a little star in the corner. That's a big star. If you aren't able to consistently provide and kind of do the reporting and review process, then you will be removed as a signatory. So there is I guess an exit process as well for the UNEP banking principles. I'd love to hand, I think, back to Puleng at this point for the next section. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Emily. I will be handing over back to Neru to run us through the implementation. Neru, let's just get the slides to move.
Thanks, Puleng.
Neru, over to you.
Okay, so what's obviously been recognized is that the principles have good intentions, but the more important part of principles is how to implement and integrate the principles in your practices. So there is a implementation guidance as part of the document that's already on the website, and it sets out the relevance of an intention behind each principle and provides guidance on how it can be implemented. There's specific guidance under each principle, and we alluded a little bit to that when we described the principles for banks and are just starting out, as well as for banks that are relatively advanced. And this also relates to what Emily indicated earlier. Next slide, please. Okay, the implementation doesn't happen in isolation, and as banks we recognize that we need to share information and help each other along this journey. So there's, in addition to UNEP FI, so there's ample support that's being developed to allow ease of implementation of each principle. So amongst these is the responsible banking dashboard, and the dashboard objective will enable banks to self-assess where they stand with regards to implementation of each principle and provide guidance on what steps and measures they could take next. In addition to the dashboard, there are case studies and cutting-edge research that I think Demetrios already alluded to. Peer learning opportunities from other UNEP FI members and banks, working groups that have already been established to assist in implementation, and annual feedback meetings. The next slide, please, Puleng.
Neru, that will bring you to the end.
Oh, okay, thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Neru. I will be handing over now to my colleague Simone to run through going forward and then to facilitate the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Puleng, and good afternoon, everybody. In terms of going forward, let's have a look at the timeline first. Well, the CEOs of the founding banks have launched the principles for public consultation in November, and that consultation is going to run until May, and then that gives us enough time to revise the framework accordingly until then the signing of the final principles on 22nd of September at United Nations headquarters during the General Assembly, so the annual meeting of heads of states. Until that time, banks and stakeholders can join the principles, not yet by signing them because they're not final, but by becoming endorsers and with that signaling that they support the principles, and that, of course, subject to changes made or agreement with changes made following the public consultation. They intend to sign the principles either on 22nd of September or within 6 months of that. That is really what we encourage banks to do, to join the initiative already now, to help build a coalition, to show your support, but also to start working together with the other banks. I think Neru has already alluded that there is quite a lot of work starting. So we're starting working on impact analysis, on target setting with regards to climate alignment, on SDG target setting, and also even more basic peer learning around sustainability strategies, governance structure, etc. So the work really to get banks fit for implementing has started. And yeah, as soon as you join, you can also join that work. And of course, as an endorser, you're already at the table and with regards to discussing the results of the consultation feedback and helping to further shape the principles. How do you become an endorser? It's very easy. Your CEO signs a letter of endorsement, and then we do a joint announcement, and we'd ask that you do a press release with a quote from your CEO, and we'd of course also take that CEO quote and put that into our public announcement. And yeah, I think that's the process for UNEP-FI members. If you're not a UNEP-FI member yet, you can become an endorser of the principles without being a UNEP-FI member, but once you're a signatory, you have to be a UNEP-FI member, so we can, provide the relevant services, both in terms of support and review, both individual and collectively. And so if you're not a UNEP-FI member yet, then there is another step in the process. So your CEO signs the principles, and you submit an application for membership, and we make a public announcement. That's from September. If you do it earlier, then your CEO signs the endorsement letter, you submit an application. So we're ready with your membership by September, and we make a public announcement together. In terms of what this means for UNEP-FI member banks, previously, when banks joined UNEP-FI, they signed the UNEP-FI Statement of Commitment. It's a great document, but it's 26 years old by now. And the UNEP-FI member banks have decided that it's time to have a new, more up-to-date commitment as a basis for UNEP-FI membership. And so we're, of course, in a transition period for 2-3 years, but the principles will over time form the basis for UNEP-FI banking membership, for the work program, and that with that replace the statement of commitment. Of course, UNEP-FI members that are already members, we very much encourage them to sign over, but they won't be forced to. And all new banks that are joining UNEP-FI will from the beginning be asked to sign the principles as a condition for membership. That's very broadly what we're heading towards. And I think now you've received a quite good amount of information. So I'm sure and I hope that you have a lot of questions and comments. We're very happy to take both. We have a few questions in the questions box already, and so I'll read them out. But also please feel free to either type questions into the questions box and we read them, or to just raise your hand so we can unmute you, and with that you can then just ask your question directly. So we have a few questions from Antonique Koning. Antonique, thank you very much for those questions. Will signing banks be screened before they can join the initiative? If so, how? The answer is no. So banks can join the initiative at any stage, really no matter where they stand in terms of integrating sustainability, in terms of contributing to society's goals, in terms of understanding and improving their impact. Where the review comes in is once they are a member, once they are an advanced bank. That's really where the annual review and feedback is there. And for advanced banks, then at some point also the more formal review, where continuous and unexplained non-performance could then lead to the bank being removed from the list of signatories, being asked to leave the initiative. But no, there is no initial screening. There are no initial conditions for joining up. Just once you join up, the bank actually needs to be doing things and needs to be implementing. Also from Antonique, we have a question. Can you give an example of a positive and a negative impact beyond environmental impact? Yeah, I mean, there are impacts banks might have, for example, on gender and on the ability of women versus men founding businesses, depending on what kind of collateral they accept, for example, depending on how they structure financial services to women. That could be something where banks can have positive and negative impacts. In terms of employment, banks can have positive and negative impacts, access to education. So we think there's quite a few things with regards to the SDGs. What is the procedure for exit of a non-complying bank? So we hope that will never happen, but the procedure that is being discussed at the moment, and we are, in the process of further shaping the principles, is that an advanced bank every year undergoes a review if they're meeting requirements around, transparency, setting targets, making progress. And if that bank consistently does not fulfill the requirements, does not provide a reasonable explanation, does not respond to formal asks of the banking governance body to redress its non-fulfillment of requirements, then the current thinking is that the banking governance body would put a recommendation to all signatories that bank be removed from the list of signatories, and that the signatories would then collectively vote on that or approve that decision. As I said, that's the current draft, but that's certainly a process that needs further development and is open to inputs at this point. Is there any cost involved in being a member or signatory? So Antonique, I can't see here which bank you're from, the World Bank. So generally, this is the same as being a UNEP-FI member. So UNEP-FI members already pay a UNEP-FI membership fee. So that would stay the same, just that we have a different framework. Where a little bit of extra cost comes in is for advanced banks for the external review, but that's really a review, and that's being kept very small scale and on a few selected criteria, not on the entire implementation of the principles, and not an assurance. And so the cost for that should be very reasonable. Do banks sign at group level or at each main entity level? We've both is possible. It depends a little bit. So we've had a few conversations with cooperative banks, which are often very, very small, and a few hundred of them then are together in one group. There, it makes sense for the group to sign up. Because otherwise we have 300 tiny little banks, and that would be very difficult to handle. But then also we have very large international banks that have acquired banks in other countries, where the subsidiary can also sign up by themselves. I'm thinking, for example, of a bank like Santander Brazil could sign up. Or a bank like Citibanamex in Mexico could sign up. So from our perspective, both is possible, but it is, of course, also a question of, what makes sense and what is logical and doable. And that was actually a question from Kate. But Antonique, I will unmute you for a second because we had 4 or 5 questions from you just to hear if we've actually answered your questions properly. So you're unmuted from my side, Antonique. You appear as self-muted currently.
Okay, thanks very much. It's Antonique Koning from CGAP, actually. We're housed in the World Bank, but we're a global think tank that works on advancing financial inclusion. I'm very interested in the principles, and I really applaud that this is an initiative that has been really coming from the banking sector itself. And so I'm very interested to learn more about it. And I think this notion of how do you hold each other accountable amongst the banks is going to be quite a commitment and a challenge, I think. You've responded very well to my questions. I mean, maybe the cost question I raised partly also thinking about smaller organizations, but you suggested, like the example of cooperatives, that can be dealt with probably as well. With regard to the positive and negative impacts, I really liked the way that you responded using examples of gender, which is indeed one of the challenges that we encounter in financial inclusion. The gender gap is still significant globally. There's still, even though access to financial services improves and increases, according to Findex data, the gender gap is actually not diminishing. So it's great to see banks, mainstream banks included, are taking this seriously. The reason why I'm interested in this initiative is also because of an initiative that I'm myself looking at, and that is how can we get more financial service providers to care about customer outcomes, and therefore this question that I had about negative and positive impact, because I think that the notion of what kind of outcomes that we want to achieve with financial services is really important. And I would then say we're looking more at outcomes that are maybe closer in the realm of what financial service providers can actually influence, such as giving people choice, the transparency issues that came up in your presentation as well, making sure that people are actually empowered to use the services, that it's straightforward to choose the right service for them, that there's suitability, and that people are basically treated fairly. And these are all quite obvious and automatic things, but in real life it seems quite challenging when you have decentralized organizations. And so I'm very glad to hear the focus on governance and culture also throughout these principles. So yeah, very interested to learn more, and I would be very keen to engage with some of the banks that are taking this up and seriously. And we at CGAP are also trying to see how we can help bridge some of the gaps that exist between the regulator's perspective on customer outcomes and those of the banks. So let me stop here. Since I asked so many questions, I just wanted to give you a bit of background as to why my interest.
I'm informed I'm on mute. No, I said fantastic, Antonique, and thanks very much for that. The reason we're hosting webinars is, to have questions and to have interaction. So no, that's great to hear. I think this perspective of customer outcome is quite important to the banks, and I think it comes out quite strongly in Principle 3, where it's really, well, how do we achieve impact as banks? Well, through working with our customers and clients, and advising and supporting and incentivizing them, and helping them make good choices and be well prepared and well positioned for the future. So no, fully agreed. And do send us an email. We're very happy to put you in touch with the various banks, and of course also to further engage directly and see how we can collaborate. And don't forget that stakeholders can also become endorsers, so do consider that opportunity. We do have a few more questions from lots of people. Kate Cacciatore. Kate, I think I've answered your first question already, but let's go to the second one. What about those banks that already publish a comprehensive sustainability report? Do they have to fill in another template, duplication of efforts? So Kate, this was really something that the banks that developed this, the 28 banks, I think were very clear on. Actually, I think maybe I'll let some of them answer to that. while we're on the call, so I don't have to be answering all the questions. So I don't know. I see Neru in front of me on the screen. Neru, maybe you want to answer with regards to the reporting and how we've tried to keep that to an absolute minimum.
Okay, so I think the banks were quite clear that they don't want to be duplicating efforts. So we all recognize that most of us are doing integrated reports. Some of us are doing integrated reports separately to sustainability reports. And so far, we have a wealth of information in these reports. So we don't want to set up an additional, report. So we have discussed amongst the banks that everything should be included in what we already have. So build on what we already have, and not try and do something new as well as. And in terms of our normal assurance, in most cases, all of us are being assured by a third party when it does come to that. We will just extend the activities of the assurer if we are at that advanced stage where it's needed. But definitely, the idea was to minimize the duplication of efforts. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that, Neru. I think, let me see if we have another question from Kate. No. So, Kate, I will unmute you. And with that, hopefully make sure that we got all your questions. My colleague here just... Okay, you need to put in an audio pin, Kate. Somehow you're dialing in via phone. I've sent you that pin just now. My colleague just reminded me that you're from Edmond Rothschild. And so maybe your question around at what level to sign pertained more to, different parts of the business versus the group than it did to, smaller entities versus larger entities. Okay, Kate, I'll leave you maybe a couple of minutes to see how we can unmute you. Otherwise, if you also want to just type into the question box, if we've answered your questions, if you have a follow-up question, then let's do that. We have more questions here from Sabrine Salman, asking, are there any other disclosure requirements apart from completing the UNEP-FI template and submitting that to UNEP-FI annually? So you wouldn't just be submitting that to us, that would be part of your public reporting. From my perspective, all the disclosure requirements are covered with the template. James, Neru, Emily, I don't know if you want to add anything here. Okay, it seems like not. So Sabrine, no, the disclosure requirements are what we're asking for in the reporting template, and that information needs to be in your public reporting. All we get is a list of references to where it can be found. And not only we get that, but that should be publicly available. Sabrine, I hope that answered your question. Let me just check. I've unmuted you from my side, Sabrine. You able to speak?
Yep. Hi, Simone. Thanks so much. That answers my question.
Fantastic. Any other questions you want to raise while we have you unmuted?
Nope, I think I'm good. Everything's been very clear. Thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Thanks very much, Sabrine. Then we have a question here from Ingrid Ascheldrut. I'm sure I'm pronouncing this name horribly. Apologies for that, Ingrid. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm working in Nordea, one of our founding members, great, and wondering how I as an employee can be ambassador and implement the principles in my daily work. Great. I work in operations, but more generally, what can employees do?
I think that's a good one to hand over to the banks.
That's a very good one to hand over to the banks. Emily and Nehru and James, what would you recommend to Ingrid? And Ingrid, fantastic question. That's exactly the right attitude. James, shall we start with you?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you very well.
Okay,
Thanks, James.
great. Yeah, great question, Ingrid. I think that in a way that's obviously going to be something for how Nordea will want to proceed. But in general terms, I think that because this is all about mobilizing a journey for every bank, dependent on their starting point, it's about being able to engage everyone in every level of the bank in terms of what do you see as the relevant challenges in your sphere of influence, and sort of what you see in terms of where you think Nordea can be making a difference. And you know, for sure, in terms of large impacts, that can be about deployment of capital and lending, which is obviously the primary kind of impacts from a bank, but also in terms of how the bank engages with customers with different needs, in terms of various aspects of inclusion, through every kind of aspect. There's always the next thing that can be done, and I think that from that point of view, this whole the underpinning drive of the principles is to be a race to the top, to try and to share and encourage best practice wherever it is. So it'd be great to kind of add various kind of throw a spotlight on different things which kind of are exemplary process to inspire others elsewhere in the banking industry.
Perfect. Thanks very much, James. Emily, you want to add to that?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you so much for that question. I think it's a really important one to be thinking about as we are kind of moving towards the launch of the principles in September. And I guess in terms of the principles themselves, what is very exciting about them is that it is a coalition of many different banks, and it is a community. And so within that community, the individuals are hugely important in the progress of the principles themselves, and so the individuals within the broader community of our banks who are delivering on the principles are really essential for the advocacy for the principles. So I think it's you know, it's about many different things that individuals can do, whether it's educating themselves on green financing, sustainable financing, whether it's working and kind of advocating for the principles in their organizations, and kind of, if you're in a smaller organization, advocating to your senior leadership. If you're in a larger organization, advocating to the big offices that sit around our senior leadership, and using the opportunity to have those conversations around this topic, because it really is a collective effort, and so requires all of our individual actions. So I thought that was a fantastic question. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Emily. Nehru, anything to add in terms of concrete to-dos for all employees from Land Bank?
So yeah, once again, just to emphasize, it is a really good question. I think the colleagues in the operations section are really probably the most important colleagues in ensuring that we live the principles. I come from a strategy environment, so we can develop the strategy, but our dependence is on the operation colleagues who execute and implement the principles. So whether it's in terms of meeting targets, you know, that your other colleagues in the strategy may have set for you, we depend on you to execute and deliver on the targets. Again, in terms of what James and Emily said, it's a collaborative effort within a bank, and so the success of the bank in terms of achieving the principles is not dependent on only the ones that are designing or the strategy around the principles. It hinges squarely on the frontline staff of the bank who execute all the work, who interface with clients, who interface with stakeholders. So it's vitally important that they not only believe completely in the principles, but also contribute to ensuring that we live
Perfect. Thanks very much, Nero. Maybe to add from our side, Ingrid, I think the frontline people are the ones that really understand what impact the provided financing has on the ground, both on the clients, but also on the clients' activities, and with that on broader society and environment. You're the ones who really know the client, work with the client. So beyond understanding and advising your other colleagues on what impacts there are and maybe what opportunities for positive impact, you're also the ones to advise and encourage clients and understand how clients can be brought to be part of the transition, and with that help meet the target. So I think a lot of the information on impact comes from you to feed up both on negative impact and on opportunities for creating more positive impact, and for how to do that, and what levers and triggers it needs to actually implement change, but then also to take the targets, to take the direction, and to go work with the clients to make it happen. I hope that is a little bit of a satisfactory answer to a big question, Ingrid. I'll unmute you real quick because we're very interested in hearing from you. So Ingrid, you should be able to speak. Ingrid, your audio seems fine from our side, but we don't hear you. I don't know if you're somehow muted from your side. Okay, Ingrid, I'll leave this line open from our side, and maybe you'll come in a minute, or otherwise just let us know via the questions box if we've done an okay job. Kate Cacciatore is asking, how comprehensive is the reporting template? So all of you can go have a look at the reporting template. It's available on the website. It's, of course, the draft reporting template. So that means it will be very important to get your inputs and feedback. Currently, it has 13 questions. And as we said before, for each question, all we need is a reference to where in your public reporting can information be found to answer that question. Maria Eugenia from Itaú is asking, we have subsidiaries and they have different maturities and they are in different stages. In the future, should we report progress by subsidiary? That is a very good question. I don't know if any of the three banks want to go first on this, or if you'd like us to answer, Emily, James, and Nero. Nero, I can't hear you.
So you can go ahead, Simon.
I've got one perspective, which is I think that there are going to be, depending on where those subsidiaries are, obviously they may be very different operating contexts, and to the extent they are, the priorities are likely to be differentiated, and therefore I think that probably makes sense to kind of to at least have something which is done at a subsidiary level, as well as how it's consolidated at a group level. We at the moment only have branches. We will have a subsidiary most likely in the UK, depending on what happens in the next few weeks. And I haven't given that probably as much attention as maybe we should have, but I think that there's probably going to be a lot to depend upon the difference in the operating context between different types of subsidiaries within a consolidated group.
I think that's a very valid response. Let me just see if, Eugenia, we have answered your question. I'm just going to unmute you real quick. Maria Eugenia, I think you're muted still from your... here we go.
Yes. Can you listen to me?
Yeah.
Who answered before? It wasn't so clear, the sound.
Right.
My question is not. I asked about the report, but today listen to you. I was thinking how we are going to work with our subsidiaries. So probably first we should do our holding process and then talk with our subsidiaries, and probably they should have their own assessment, their own impact analysis. Otherwise, it would be very difficult for the future. So listen to you today. I can assume that we should have a different process in our different subsidiaries. So that's my first thought about our subsidiaries, and I understand that we should talk more about that, because it's not an easy task when we have different places all over the world.
Absolutely, Maria Eugenia. Maybe just to repeat a little bit what James said. The line wasn't very good. I think he goes very much in your direction. I think what he's saying is, look, if the subsidiaries are in various different countries, even maybe in different parts of the world, then the operating context is very different, and the countries they operate in and the societies might have different challenges and priorities. And even like the subsidiaries might portfolio-wise have a very different exposure from between different countries in terms of what industries they're financing. So it probably makes a lot of sense to look at the subsidiary level. What are the impacts? Where should the targets be? And maybe there are a few areas that are common and can be brought to a group level, and maybe there are areas that are more specific and should stay at the subsidiary level. Does that make sense from your perspective, Maria Eugenia?
Yes. I never had thought that before. So hard work.
Yeah, well, that's once we get started, right? These questions come up, and we're very happy, Maria Eugenia, that Itaú is on board and is already working with us on implementation. Very good to have you guys.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much, Maria Eugenia. We have another question here from Antonique. How does this initiative relate to the Equator Principles? Who wants to take that question? Okay.
I was going to say, just in general terms, like anything like Equator Principles, there's incorporation by reference in terms of best practices. So if you're working in project finance, then generally speaking, then there'll be things where Equator Principles apply. Then that would be part of the implementation guidelines to suggest that, or if it's overtaken or superseded by other things, would be implemented in how you go about implementing the principles. But it's not stipulated as a sort of a list of must do, because it's for each bank to understand where their profiles of impact are most felt.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that, James. And maybe to add from my side, Antonique, the principles for responsible banking really apply across all business areas and at strategic, portfolio, and transaction level. And the Equator Principles are very much a transaction-focused framework specifically for project finance. So as James said, we see them as a way to implement your broader commitments under the principles for responsible banking, and thus in the implementation guidance, if you have a look, we do recommend that banks apply the Equator Principles in their project finance. I hope that answers your question, Kate. If not, do let us know in the question box. Those are all the questions that are popping up right now in the question box. So I guess last question to the round, are there any more things you want to raise? And it doesn't just have to be questions. It can also be comments, feedback. I mean, we are in a public consultation. And so really also purpose of these webinars is to get your inputs and your feedback and your views to how the current framework needs to be further changed, adapted, refined. Maybe you've read through it, you've encountered some concerns that you see with regards to your banks doing this, or things that seem unclear, etc. So please do raise them.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cesar Villatoro from BFA El Salvador. Can you hear me?
We hear you very well, Cesar, and thank you very much for joining.
Okay, well, I want to ask how does this reporting relate to the GRI methodology? Because we are implementing that from this year ahead. So that's my question.
Okay, maybe first option to the banks if they want to provide an answer. Otherwise, we can go ahead. I don't know, Nero, James, Emily, do you want to answer to that, or shall we go ahead?
This is Emily. Great to hear that you're implementing the GRI. We also subscribe to the GRI methodology, and we find it extremely helpful for our reporting. It's not mutually exclusive, so as Simone mentioned, the template for the reporting will link to your existing reporting, so it can link to your reporting that has the GRI methodologies. But the template, if you take a look, has specific questions of things that you need to show for the principles, which isn't related to the methodology that you're using within your reporting. But also, it's great to hear that you are using the GRI, and I think I'm not sure, Simone. You can check if is it in the guidance document as a useful methodology for reporting as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the GRI methodology will help us a lot to answer how we are acting on the principles, and will be just have to define a specific. Well, I hear some.
We're getting background noise from somebody. It would be fantastic if people could mute themselves. Okay. We've muted everyone again, sorry. Cesar, I'll have to manually unmute just you. Apologies for that. Okay, Cesar, you should be able to speak again now.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry. Yeah.
We'll just put that chapter on our sustainability report according to the UNEP 5 principles, and using, I think, for most of that part, the indicators and KPIs obtained with the GRI methodology. And if we have something that the GRI methodology doesn't provide, we will have to seek how we will put that in order to reinforce our accomplishment of the principles.
Exactly, Cesar. Look, from our perspective, there's no new reporting methodology required. So really what the pragmatic way is, go with your GRI reporting and see where maybe there is some information that is required to be disclosed for the principles that is not in the GRI reporting yet, and add that in. But we do see, like you, a fairly substantial overlap for the two, so it should really be, adding a few indicators, and especially maybe around impact and target setting. But really, yeah, the GRIs is fantastic reporting, and there's no attempt here to, provide another reporting methodology or a different way. So yeah, go with what you have and what you're building there, and then maybe add the indicators and metrics that are needed in addition.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Cesara. I'll try once again to unmute everyone. Let's see. So that way people can just speak up. You need to make sure you're not muted from your side. Let's hope this works for a little without any background noise. Do we have any more questions, comments, feedback that people would like to make? Really, this is the point in time to help shape these principles and make sure they're applicable and helpful for your organization as well. I think Neru is gonna leave us. Okay, I think there are no more questions at this point.
No, I think he wants to speak.
I think Neru wants to speak. Sorry, apologies, Neru.
Okay, no. I just wanted to say on the previous comment, we actually had an engagement with the local GRI office in South Africa, where we raised a similar point earlier, what was raised earlier. And so the colleagues in the GRI office in South Africa were saying that what is likely going to happen, and this is still on the cards and for discussion within the GRI, is that they would probably provide a link between the principles and the GRI methodologies. So that's very likely the future in terms of, how do you link the two? Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that, Neru. Okay, we don't see any more questions in the questions box, and we're not hearing anybody. So I think with that, we close the webinar. I hand back over to Puleng for doing that.
All right, so well, thank you everybody for joining. Just to reiterate a few things that have been said throughout. So we are still in the consultation period until the end of May. So if you do have comments, please do provide us with those comments. You can do that by visiting our website and following the link that will take you to the online consultation page, or you can write to us. We also have details of the events that we will be holding in different areas, and those really will mostly be run by the founding banks. And so please keep an eye out for those events and attend if you can in your regions. And if you do support the principles, we encourage you to become endorsers. And I think with that, is there anything else, Simone, that you would like to? Okay, great. Then thank you very much for joining, and thank you very much to our panelists, Demetrius, Emily, Neru, and James. Thank you for also joining to answer some questions. And thank you to our participants for basically attending the webinar. And I think we'll end on that note. Have a good afternoon, evening to everybody, and morning if there's as well. All right, cheers.
Bye.
Bye.